This is a relic from medieval Europe, a time when faith held extraordinary sway over life and death. Can you guess what it is? A rusted chain. Chains were used throughout history, but this one was likely forged in the fires of suppression. That's right. This was part of a larger artifact. Can you name that?
How about now? Yeah, finally.
These rusty shackles once bound the book. How is that? Let me explain. In the heart of medieval Europe, brilliant minds were racing ahead of their time. They studied the stars, experimented with medicine, and questioned how the world worked. But many paid a high price, not from enemies or war but from the church. What happens when knowledge challenges power? This is the dark story of how science was seen as heresy, and how some of history's greatest thinkers were silenced. During the Middle Ages, the church was more than just a religious institution. It was the ultimate authority, controlled not only faith, but also education, politics, and knowledge. Questioning the teachings of the Bible was considered blasphemy, and the penalty could be imprisonment or death. Most knowledge was filtered through a religious lens. Earth was the center of the universe. Sickness was divine punishment, and to say otherwise was dangerous. Yet amidst this sea of faith, a few daring souls ventured into uncharted waters. Think of it like those thrilling pirate tales. There was treasure to be found, but it was hidden and dangerous to seek. These folks weren't necessarily pirates themselves, but they had the spirit of adventure and a thirst for discovery. They were drawn to nature, mathematics, and even human anatomy. Today we call them scientists. Then they had no such label. They were just seekers of knowledge. And they operated in the shadows because their work could cost them dearly. Let's meet a trailblazer named Roger Bacon. Living in the 13th century, he explored optics, mathematics, and even the beginnings of the scientific method. He loved experimenting, observing, and understanding the world around him. But you can imagine that during a time when questioning the church teachings was risky, being a scientist wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Roger Bacon experienced firsthand the price one could pay for curiosity. At one point, he found himself locked up because the church saw his thirst for knowledge as a threat. Imagine that. In the year 1260, he wrote a book called Opus Majus. In it, he talked about all sorts of cool stuff from perspective to lenses to germs. Talk about being ahead of your time. The church didn't take kindly to his ideas and shut down his work. Now that's a bummer. But Bacon's ideas didn't really disappear. They just went underground, passed around in secret writings until they could finally come out into the open. You see, despite the risk, many scholars couldn't help but explore the unknown. They made tools to understand the heavens like astrolabes and armillary spheres. They dissected animals to learn about anatomy and observed nature to understand its patterns. Yet they had to hide their work. It was a real catch-22 situation. They needed knowledge to do science, but gaining that knowledge could land them in hot water. So what did they do? They disguised their findings, hiding them in plain sight. They might have written about astrology, alchemy, or natural philosophy. All these topics were considered safe by the church, so they were good covers for their secret science. Kind of like playing a game of hide and seek with the authorities. Now let's turn the page to a darker chapter. Enter the Inquisition. Established in the 12th century, it was like a special investigative team within the church. Its job was to hunt down and stop heresy, which basically meant anyone who went against church teachings. During this time, even asking questions could get you into trouble. The inquisitors were tough. They had special courts to try people accused of heresy. If you went against the church and were found guilty, well, things could get really bad. The punishments ranged from being put in jail to being forced to change your beliefs too, and this is really grim, being tortured. Yes, torture. And if it didn't work, they might even kill you. What kind of science was considered a sin? Well, anything that challenged the church's view of the world was on the radar. If you believed the earth went around the sun instead of the other way around, you might raise eyebrows. If you broke open a human body to study its parts, that was also a big no-no. And even doing math in certain ways was seen as suspicious. It was a time when the church had a tight grip on what people could think and say. Books were the main way to spread ideas back then, so they were a bit protective of them. They had special rules about what could be written and taught, and they kept a close eye on what people were reading. After all, if you read something that goes against the church, you might start thinking the wrong thoughts. In the end, it wasn't just about religion, It was about keeping control. The church wanted to make sure everyone believed what they taught and didn't question it. But you know what they say, curiosity never killed a cat, but it sure did ruffle a lot of feathers back then. And now, let's shine our spotlight on the incredible minds who dared to challenge the status quo. Some who even paid the ultimate price for their beliefs. First, let's talk about a man named Giordano Bruno. This guy was a true trailblazer, a Dominican friar who wasn't afraid to go against the grain. He came up with some pretty radical ideas for his time, like the fact that there were probably infinite stars out there, each with their own planets and moons, just like our solar system. He was also a big believer in the heliocentric theory, and he thought that the Earth and other planets revolved around the sun, not the other way around. To say that these ideas were controversial would be an understatement. In 1592, Bruno published his views in a book called The Infinite Universe, and his reputation as a heretic was sealed. When the church got wind of his beliefs, they weren't happy to say the least. They dragged him to a special court where he was charged with heresy. Instead of backing down, Bruno stood his ground, refusing to renounce his beliefs, even though it meant that he might lose his freedom, maybe even his life. And that's exactly what happened. In 1600, he was burned at the stake for his beliefs. Talk about a fiery end. Next up, we have Galileo Galilei. Now, he's a name you might have heard before. Galileo was an Italian astronomer and physicist who lived during the Renaissance period, but his story definitely spills over into medieval times. He was a bit of a rebel when it came to science, always questioning and observing the world around him. One of his biggest contributions was using the telescope to study the heavens. He discovered moons around Jupiter, craters and mountains on the moon, and even phases of Venus. His observations provided solid evidence for heliocentrism, that whole idea that the Earth revolves around the sun. Once again, this didn't sit well with the church. They didn't like the idea that their long-held beliefs about the universe might be wrong. Galileo got into big trouble because of this, and was called to a trial in 1633. The church basically told him to recant, to publicly say that he was wrong, and sadly, he agreed. Under threat of torture, Galileo spent his last years under house arrest, continued to study and write, but his groundbreaking work was kept secret to avoid further conflict with the church. And remember, these are just two names among many. There were monks who hid anatomical drawings, mathematicians whose work was lost, and healers who were branded heretics for their methods. It has a long list of brilliant minds that were almost forgotten because of the times they lived in. But wait, the story doesn't end there. Searchers today are unearthing hidden manuscripts. Some were tucked away in monastery basements for centuries, while others are being brought back from the brink thanks to new tech. Some texts were even found on palimpsests, old books, where the original writing was erased and replaced. We're talking about going back in time, literally. With the help of computers and artificial intelligence, scientists are able to peer under the surface of these texts, deciphering the hidden words. It's like a treasure hunt, but instead of gold coins, we're finding lost theories, experiments, and ideas that were buried under layers of erasure. These discoveries are rewriting history. They're showing us that medieval science wasn't a dead end. It was suppressed, hidden from view, but never truly extinguished. As you've seen, the story of science and faith in the Middle Ages isn't a simple one. There were those in the church who championed knowledge, but there were also those who wielded its power to control. Ultimately, history shows us that you can shackle a body, but never the mind. If you believe history still has secrets waiting to be uncovered, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share the wisdom of the past with friends, because sometimes it's in the shadows that the brightest truths are found.